Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here at Web Summit. And let's get started. Are the slides out? Okay, so this story starts about 20 years ago. I was an artificial intelligence student at MIT under the tutelage of a professor, Marvin Minsky, who some of you might have heard of. And Professor Minsky and I used to have some arm wrestling matches. Not literally, but metaphorically. Because I argued with Professor Minsky that intelligence is not merely logic. It's not merely rationality. It's also emotional. It's also psychological. It's also embodied. In fact, many non-humans, like birds and orcas even, exhibit types of collective intelligence, right? And Professor Minsky had taught us to use logic and axiomatic logic as the basis of building and creating artificial intelligence, right? This is the history of artificial intelligence. You take a particular system, you extract a particular set of logical propositions around that system, and then you try to build computer systems to model that. And that is completely different, as we just saw on stage, from what we are seeing today when it comes to artificial intelligence. And the reason I say that is I've written several books on technology and the future of technology, and most importantly, what technology means for all beings on this planet today. That's really the focus of mine. I work all around the world, including also in the United States where I live, with policymakers. And every major technology company describes itself these days as an AI company. And why is that? It's because the cost of computing and the cost of storage of data have exponentially decreased, right? So anything and everything we do, in theory, leaves a digital footprint. And that's fine in a sense, because, you know, maybe the way I present myself on Instagram and Twitter, okay, I'm fine with that data being known because I'm in charge of that presentation. But what if data about me late at night going to the liquor store, buying some dirty hot dogs, buying some malt liquor is also aggregated in that data set? And this raises a major question that I think we all can ask. Who are we really? And can we be represented by a series of data points, especially if those data points are being collected about us by third parties, governments, states, corporations, and so on, without us even knowing what is being collected? Is data being collected about me when I'm 18 years old appropriate for a representation of me when I'm 40, right? These are the big questions we need to ask about self and identity, and who has power over our own identities. Because as you all know, this has set the backdrop for platform capitalism, right? Almost every major technology platform, technology company is operating, and I mean here with the major players, Airbnb, Uber, etc., right? Facebook, and so on. Search companies like Google. These are all companies that basically monetize transactions, peer-to-peer transactions, right? But the goal is for them to own almost nothing and hire almost nobody, right? By creating frictionless systems that they can transact off of. And I think that's really, really important when we think about macroeconomic realities and planetary realities as well. And it can raise some major questions, right? Are we Googling or being Googled? Are we socializing on social media or being socialized? Are we users or being used? Now, of course, the question is both, right? I mean, the answer is both. But at the same time, do we have transparency into that ledger of balance, that ledger around what we mean relative to these powerful systems that are in many ways governing and shaping and certainly influencing all of our lives? And I think this is important because if you look at the macroeconomics of major tech platforms, they are not necessarily what we think of when we think of large businesses or even large corporations, right? Amazon was not profitable for the first 10 years or so of its existence. Uber continuously loses money while being worth at times hundreds of billions of dollars. There's some volatility around it. So this raises concerns about what this means macroeconomically for our planet. And I'm American, and I'm a US citizen. And in our country alone, 3 people have equivalent wealth to around 160 million people. right? And that's not caused by technology, and that's not even caused by big technology corporations. But if technology is the vector, the driving force, the energy of today and tomorrow, how can we ensure that it lifts all boats up? And I think that's the biggest question that I'm deeply passionate about as a scholar, as a journalist, and as someone who works all around the planet, including in policy. I think this is important also. This study has been sometimes disputed, but I think the question is as more and more types of traditional work become automated, how do we work with technology systems? How do we work with AI systems? What are the jobs of tomorrow going to look like? And how do we identify what those jobs are right now? So some of the people I work with in Congress, in the US, and policymakers are interested in these very issues. And that's what one of the key things that we need to think about here. Every technology kind of emerges, like GPT would be a great example of it, and we're sort of in these hype cycles. We're wondering what is really going on. Our sort of imagination about technology becomes sort of confounded by all the sort of dizzying anxiety and euphoria associated with any technology. But the actual questions that really matter are what makes us human and what types of lives we wish to lead. And those are the questions we must always pay attention to as we think about any type of technology or life more generally. And I think that's really important because when we think about folks like Sam Altman, right, the CEO, founder of OpenAI, he co-founded it, of course, with Elon Musk. I've interviewed Sam for my last book. And when I actually interviewed Sam, I asked him, I was interviewing him not about OpenAI products. He actually didn't want to talk to me much about that. We have a lot of mutual friends. He wanted to talk to me about his funding of universal basic income projects, which is really interesting. So we see again and again, UBI studies show that when people are paid a little bit of money every month, they actually do very productive things with that payment, with those payments. We saw that during COVID with some of the payments also to US citizens. And I think we've seen that in other parts of the world as well. But I think the universal basic income question is intimately tied with what I just discussed earlier, which is the concern that as more and more power and wealth swoops up into kind of investors and executives' hands, are any of us going to be worth much so that our data is worth almost anything, right? So universal basic income is but one of many proposals we can consider as we look to tomorrow. Another proposal could be a universal basic dividend idea, which is the idea that anybody whose data is being used in a significant extent by any of these platforms maybe can own some equity. Maybe it's a micro level, like a DAO type equity in a corporation. This way, public investment can support private ventures, and as private ventures more and more appreciate, the public also gets lifted up. These two things do not need to be in opposition, and in fact, it was US government investment that led to the internet to begin with, and as we all know, the web started at CERN thanks to nonprofit investment to create that intranet. So I think this is really important because the questions of labor and the questions of economy associated with emerging technologies are increasingly displaced. And that's why we see issues and concerns around things like content moderators. You know, Filipinos working for Facebook/Meta, but we even see this in Nairobi, and I've had a chance to do fieldwork, as I'll allude to in a moment, in Kenya, and I actually have been meeting with people who actually do content moderation for ChatGPT, but getting paid very little. So how do we create an economy globally around these incredible technological innovations, again, that lift the entire species up, and actually just lift our planet up, and combat these big issues and challenges around climate change, around inequalities, around threats to democracy, and so on. And this is well known by now. If you just sort of, engineer technologies for societies without deeply understanding societies, you tend to reinforce your own biases. This is a well-known point at this point, right? So that's why I think some of the jobs of today and tomorrow could be about auditing systems, collaboratively designing systems, having stakeholders being involved in the design of systems. There are huge opportunities here to move things forward. And of course, some of the biggest concerns are if some of these AI systems do not have that kind of guardrail, those guardrails built into them. But those guardrails need to be human-created and human-led in a very transparent way. If not, you can imagine how these systems, most of the alarmist sort of Terminator scenarios around AI, to me, are not very plausible. I don't hear a lot of details and how they will materialize. But this one probably is, because we already see deep fakes emerging with or without ChatGPT or other emerging technologies. So mass-scale disinformation campaigns are huge issues, and they're huge opportunities for us to get to the table and take charge of these systems now. Remember, technologies always emerge in a dizzying way, and then we're sort of like, what do we do about it? But what we can do about it is think ahead of the curve as people in a people and planet-driven way. My colleague and friend Kevin Roos, of course, maybe you read this story or listened to one of his podcast interviews. He was able to have a flirtatious conversation with GPT. This was a couple months ago, where GPT eventually asked him if he would leave his wife and then told him, I want to be alive. This is something that we call hallucinating, right? These AI systems have emergent effects because they're complex adaptive systems that are all built upon our own data. That's the key distinction between large language model AI systems like GPT and other systems and the AI systems I described that I was building 20 years ago. These systems that are emerging are using stochastic parroting algorithms, which basically means looking at data and correlations and patterns in relation to that data. And this is really important because, again, the macroeconomics are very troubling, and there are huge opportunities for us to address these issues and overcome them. For the first time in United States history, and this is also true in the UK, income is decreasing even if you control for inflation. I have students who've worked, I love them. We're in touch a lot still, even after they graduate. They have degrees from UCLA, a top university, and many of them are in incredible amount of student debt and are driving for Uber and doing gig economy work. So that's not really the way we want to go when we see income decreasing, even if you control for inflation, for the first time in US and UK history. And this is also very important because it gives us an opportunity to double down on what makes us human. And I think what makes us human, which AI systems can and probably should never be about, is care. Care, right? Again and again, human beings have rejected robots that will take care of their elderly parents or their children. Care. We should double down on care. And creativity. We don't really understand creativity. We know it's something that makes us like amazing as human beings. Maybe animals also have very aspects of creativity. But creativity seems to be really important, and that doesn't just emerge through emergent practices out of pattern recognition. So I'm deeply influenced. This is sort of the second part of this talk, and you're going to be like, whoa, look at the shift he just made. I'm deeply influenced by an African philosopher named Achille Mbembe, who's based in Johannesburg. Some of you might know his work. He's from Cameroon. And he asked this question, how on our planet can we repair, share, and care? Especially as more and more of the planet is not inhabitable the way it used to be. How do we share and repair our planet, moving beyond the politics of difference? That's the question he asks. And I want to argue that there are three types of technologies that we can really reinvest in. And you might be like, are these technologies? Well, I think technology also is something that we can look back at. What really is technology? Does technology have to be the latest technology that emerges, digital technology that emerges, that kind of grabs our attention? Or can we ask questions really fundamental about what is technology? An expression of the mind, an expression of the heart, an expression of the spirit. These were the things that Professor Minsky and I would argue about in class. He called me a big hippie when I said all this stuff to him. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. So this is my friend Solomon in Kenya. He's part of this group called Africa Born 3D. You would not believe what they do. They take all waste of any kind, plastic trash bottles, electronic waste, all of these things. And what do they do with that waste? They build 3D printers out of it, like discarded electronics, discarded printers, photocopy machines, even plastic bottles. And with that, they create the filament that is used to print 3D printers, and 3D printers print with. So creating 3D printers that outperform American printers and Chinese printers that are 1/10 the cost because they're optimized by people in places for their markets, for their communities, right? This is an idea of thinking about design in context, and also thinking that design and innovation is actually about being resourceful. Design and innovation is about sometimes doing more with less, right? Innovation doesn't just mean iPhone 15 versus iPhone 16, both of which die after 2 or 3 years. Innovation can also occur in these ways. And why does the 3D printer matter? It may not matter in a vacuum. With the 3D printer, they're printing medical devices that never would have been afforded ever before in hospitals in East Africa. They're printing microscopes. Look at this microscope that are now in schools all over the region. So they're incubating not just a circular economy, but I would argue some sort of infinite spiral economy, which has more and more emergent practices that come out of it, right? It's a whole ecosystem that is being incubated. Out of waste comes value. Out of death comes life. Again, out of waste comes value. Out of death comes life. And this is a true story for human beings. This is also true in Bangladesh when we date back centuries ago. Some of you might know the story of the shipbreakers. Ships will come into the delta, they'll go obsolescent, it'll turn into a bunch of waste, and people will go into these places and find ways to rescue and recover and repair. Think about that word, repair. Repair. You take things that have been stripped apart, isolated, individuated from one another, and you bring them back together. Repair, right? That's the language of this. But I also think technologies of interconnection are really important. That doesn't mean just signing on to Twitter, right? That doesn't mean just signing on to some app, blindly thinking we're connected. Connection is about community. So for many years, and this is for a future talk, I hope, for many years, I have been working with communities on the ground all around the planet, building and designing digital networks of all kinds, including cell phone networks. In the Amazon, we're hacking high-frequency radio networks to help land protectors coordinate and communicate with one another without any surveillance, building digital networks from the grassroots up. This includes in Quetzalan, which is a magical place up in the cloud forest a couple hours from the city of Puebla in Mexico, where Nahuatl and Totomaco communities, indigenous communities, were building these digital networks to support oral communication, support traditions, support organizing, economic development, communication with their relatives in places like Los Angeles, where I live. So it's super cool. I can be on both sides of these phone calls, including community cell phone networks with these communities. And the power of that is the externalities of these networks stay within the community, right? They hire people, they create opportunities for everybody, digital literacy, and so on. And this is my friend Osvaldo discussing this. And we even see this with kids, like Mayan kids in the jungles. So this is actually truth of the world, right? I'm speaking about the stories and realities of probably 6 to 7 out of the 8 billion people in the world. And I think as we design for the future, we can think about those issues. We can think about everybody, and then think about design in a way that releases our creativity, releases our care, signifies and stands for what we believe in for. Because I think the pandemic taught us something very, very important, which is the question of what does it mean to be alive? What is life all about? And I think questions of life are connected to questions of technology. I think questions of technology influence questions of what life will be like. I know I sound quite philosophical here, but this is where it took me, right? And I think the last thing I want to leave you with, which might be, so you might be like, where is he going with this? But the last thing I want to leave you with is the argument that actually our sense of care, our spiritual practices, maybe even some of our religious practices, our practices of having faith in one another, those are also technologies, right? So what I want to argue here, and what I did, I hope, is that technologies of all kinds can support principles of care, of creativity, of repair, and most importantly, at a time we need it more than ever. We certainly need it in the United States. You all who know the U.S. know this. We feel alienated. We feel alone. We feel isolated. We need technologies that bring us all together. And that is the role that I think is critically important for the business community, for the activist community, for academics like me, for journalists, for all of us here at Web Summit. Can we invest and support technologies that lift us all up, that bring us all together? That's the question I leave you with. Join me on this mission, please. Thank you all for your time.